Secular Student Alliance is excited to announce our annual scholarship offerings. The application opens today and is available through August of 2021. You can learn more at secularstudents.org/scholarships.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for everyone joining us. It's noon my time, so I get lunch after this. But it's great to have, I see lots of names that have been following us all along, so that's wonderful. We've got some new people here for this session, so welcome to everyone. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. Angie will be doing a presentation today, and then we'll have some Q&A afterwards. So if you have your questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A tab. For those of us who are joining us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, we do have staff who are monitoring the comments there. So please feel free to type your questions in the comments, and we'll make sure that we get those to Angie so that everyone gets to participate this as widely as possible. So yes, so Anjan, it's wonderful having you here. I'm glad we could make this happen. And just a little bit, Anjan is you're the chair, the Oppenheimer Foundation chair and professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. And so newly created endowed chair position, which is absolutely wonderful to have. And your presentation today, which I'm very pleased, is talking about respect and contempt for science. So the question of public understanding.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kevin. And I imagine that everyone can hear me now fine. And if not, someone will tell me. Just to give you the full name of my position at the University of Miami, it's actually the Appignani Foundation Chair for the Study of Atheism, Humanism, and Secular Ethics. So something I think of great interest to people here, I can imagine. Okay, great. So thanks again for the introduction. And of course, thanks to Kevin for the invitation to join you today. And let me say a very special thank you to everyone for coming out on this second day of this awesome conference. Before I get going, there's a handout containing an outline of my talk for today. I've pasted a link to it on the Zoom chat. And Kevin has very kindly agreed to, in a few minutes, just send it out to the chat again, just in case you're a latecomer and you weren't able to see that link. So you should be able to click on it now or in a few minutes and get it, but it isn't crucial, right? It might just be helpful for you to follow along or for future reference. If you want to come back to some of these ideas, you'll have a handy copy of them. And finally, by way of preface, let me just say that what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project at the intersection of thinking about science, thinking about the public and society, and really thinking about education. And it's very much at an early stage of my thinking, so I'll be especially interested in your thoughts and comments and questions in the discussion later on. So keep your brains working, and I'll be delighted to hear what you're thinking about as we go. And with all of that said, let me begin. So there are a lot of ways you might approach my topic for today, which is essentially about the public understanding of science and how this bears on the common good and the welfare of our communities and societies. There are important questions here about the roles and functions of scientific knowledge in broad social contexts. And this immediately leads to important questions regarding the economic, the political, the ethical dimensions of these roles and functions. But today I'm going to focus on one very specific piece of this puzzle, namely the public understanding of science. It's just one piece, but it's a crucial piece because the way science is conceived in the public domain is a major determinant of all of the things I've just mentioned, right? In other words, the public understanding of science is a major factor in determining what roles and functions our societies allow for scientific knowledge, because public understanding shapes how scientific knowledge is viewed in relation to things like economic and political and ethical interests and concerns. Now, I'm going to take one thing for granted as an assumption here right at the start, which I hope isn't too controversial. Among this group, I'd be amazed if it were controversial. I'm going to assume that one of the things we want the sciences to do, this may even be the most important thing that we want the sciences to do, is to serve the common good. That is, to produce knowledge that can be acted upon to promote our collective and planetary welfare. And with that assumption in hand, there's a lot at stake in the public understanding of science. If we want the sciences to serve those ends, then public understanding has to be such that it supports acting on our best science to promote those ends. For instance, by supporting the formation and adoption of effective public policy and governance. So here's what I want to do for the rest of today. Next, I'm going to try to refine the idea of public understanding by considering what, in the philosophy of science, which is my day job, people refer to as the phenomenon of knowledge transfer. That is, the phenomenon in which knowledge is transposed. It's taken from one domain into another domain, like, for example, from a lab into the wider world. And then I'm going to consider some ways in which transferring knowledge from scientific contexts into public ones inevitably faces certain challenges. And finally, I'm going to argue that in order to overcome these challenges, what we really need to do is depart from the usual ways in which people think about the public understanding of science. I'm going to argue that the public understanding of science should concern, in the first instance, not so much the content of scientific theories and models, but rather the nature of scientific knowledge. Right? And what I mean by that is something that I'll explain later on. And finally, though I won't have a lot of time to do this, I'm going to give you a suggestive sketch of some of what that means by briefly describing an account of what sorts of reflections on the nature of scientific knowledge would, in fact, result in more productive uptakes of it in the public domain, right? An uptake that might actually serve the cause of promoting the common good. Okay, so how should we think about the public understanding of science? Well, as I've just mentioned, I'd like to approach this question in the first instance by thinking about the general phenomenon of attempting to extract knowledge from one domain and then transferring it effectively into another domain. So let's follow a number of philosophers of science here and call this phenomenon knowledge transfer. Although I think that there are earlier antecedents of this idea, over the past decade, a number of philosophers have become especially interested in how scientific theorizing or modeling in one context of science sometimes ends up being incredibly useful and effective in entirely different contexts. So, for example, there have been fascinating studies of how models that were developed, say, in game theory, ultimately found their way into biology, or how modeling in physics ultimately found its way into economics, and so on. Right? The idea is that we extract some knowledge that seems to work very well over here, and then we try to do something good with it over here. Now, the public understanding of science, right, with that sort of idea of public understanding in mind, what I want to do here is generalize or extend the notion of knowledge transfer further than it was originally intended, right? So I'm interested here not so much in transferring knowledge between different contexts of scientific practice, which involves maybe applying a model or some other scientific description to different areas of scientific interest. What I'm interested in here, primarily, isn't that sort of transferring of knowledge between only scientific contexts. Rather, what I'm interested in is the idea of transferring knowledge between scientific contexts on the one hand and broader public or societal contexts on the other hand. And there are some, I think, illuminating analogies and disanalogies between how knowledge is transferred between strictly scientific contexts and how it's transferred beyond scientific contexts into the broader public domain. So let me point out just a couple of them here today, right, which are important, I think, to understanding how we should view the public understanding of science. So here's what happens in knowledge transfer between scientific contexts. When we move from one area of science into another, the subject matter, the target systems that are under consideration that we're investigating, are different. But there's something about them that's the same, right? In other words, there's some analogy or similarity between them that allows the knowledge transfer to work. That's how you get, for example, one and the same model being useful in, say, physics and in economics. Some useful knowledge transfer occurs despite the fact that these different areas, right, concern different things. When there is, in fact, some sort of similarity between the two subject matters, then knowledge transfer can be successful. Now, the idea that there's something shared or similar across scientific contexts is analogous to the idea of transferring knowledge between scientific contexts and public or societal contexts. Typically, what's shared is supposed to be some sort of factual description, right? Say, perhaps about the efficacy of a vaccine, right? A claim, a view, a theoretical assertion, maybe a prediction, maybe a retrodiction, that is making sense of observations that we've already made, maybe giving an explanation. So that's what's supposed to be shared between the scientific context and the public or societal context. But here, in a disanalogy to the idea of transferring things just between different areas of science, where we seem to be able to meet the challenge of figuring out how to interpret some shared information in a different way, in a different context, when it comes to science to society transfers, this challenge, just generally speaking, isn't being met, or at least it's not being met very well. The reason for this is that often public contexts don't or simply can't produce interpretations of the relevant scientific content that would allow for a successful transfer. I think there are likely insurmountable problems facing the transfer of scientific knowledge to the public, at least insofar as this knowledge is usually conceived very narrowly in terms of some factual descriptions, right, that the sciences discover. Okay, I know that all sounds very abstract, right? It was very abstract. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to try to unpack what I've just said in more concrete terms, right? I'm going to explain why I think that our current conception of the public understanding of science makes successful knowledge transfer from the sciences effectively impossible. And then I'm going to hint at what a better or a more successful understanding of public understanding would be. Okay, so before making good on the promise that I just made you, right, I hope you'll indulge me in a brief but nonetheless important tangent. I want to clear the ground a little by setting to one side something that is very commonly discussed in thinking about science in the public sphere. And that's what I've called on your handout forms of misinformation. A lot of excellent history, philosophy, and sociology of science has actually documented various ways in which science is sometimes corrupted by external forces at the source via things like the funder effect, right, the influence of funding, or ways in which genuine knowledge is simply misrepresented by people with economic or political or ideological interests that are at odds with, that conflict with our best science. So, for example, I have in mind here subverted science in the form of funding effects by tobacco companies or pharmaceutical companies, right? So those are cases in which research is paid for by certain parties, and then, surprise, surprise, the results disproportionately end up matching or being beneficial to the interests of those parties. So that's one thing I have in mind. I also have in mind the misrepresentation of research by non-scientific actors like, say, the anti-vaccine movement, or by climate change denialists, who sometimes emphasize statistically marginal or outlier interpretations of the relevant science, often in the service of some particular economic or political end. These are genuine challenges to knowledge transfer that don't involve knowledge simply because there's no genuine attempt here to transfer knowledge at all. In many of these cases, the whole point of the exercise is to mislead people about what's the case, not to transfer knowledge. Of course, that isn't to say that it's unimportant. On the contrary, as we all know, it's extremely important. All I'm saying is that these attempts to undermine science aren't the kind of difficulty that I'm zeroing in on here today, right? So I won't be focusing on those challenges in particular. A similar sort of caveat applies to cases of pseudoscience, right, whose practitioners may not even be trying, at least consciously, to undermine science, though certainly, right, in the course of advocating pseudoscience, you may well end up undermining science. So, for example, by promoting homeopathy, you might thereby undermine medical science concerning the relevant condition. But pseudoscience doesn't produce scientific knowledge, right? So there's no question here of scientific knowledge transfer as such. So I'd be happy to come back to these sorts of cases of failures to transfer knowledge in the discussion. But for now, let me just set them aside. Okay, so having defined what I won't be focusing on here in any detail, let me turn back now to what I do want to focus on, namely the idea that public domains of interpretation don't generally allow for interpretations of science, of scientific descriptions of things that amount to successful examples of knowledge transfer. The reason for this is something that I mentioned earlier when describing the basic idea of knowledge transfer. Scientific claims are embedded in a larger and richer interpretive context. All of the background knowledge that scientists bring to the work that they do. And when that larger interpretive context doesn't mesh well enough with whatever it is that you're attempting to transfer from one place to another, then the transfer is bound to fail. So here's an example of this. It's what on your handout I've called translational challenges. Obviously, when everything is going well, scientists engaged in a particular area of research have some significant understanding of what's going on, a significant understanding of the descriptive content of that research. And likewise, historians and philosophers of science, sometimes science journalists, commonly have a significant understanding of the relevant science that they think about deeply. Now, what happens when scientists, historians, philosophers, journalists, what happens when these people speak in the public domain about scientific knowledge? Translational challenges are ones of determining how to describe the content of science in a way that's accessible to a non-scientific audience. A description that does justice to the details is often just inaccessible, right? Because the background knowledge that's required to grasp it, which is possessed by scientists and maybe those who study the sciences carefully, is just lacking more generally. Right? Maybe it's a mathematical background, maybe it's a background in the relevant background theories in that area of science. On the other hand, descriptions of the content that don't really do justice to the details, in other words, they're simplified descriptions, often they're simply false. And even with the best will in the world, it's often very difficult sometimes, perhaps even impossible, to get the balance just right here between giving sufficient detail to avoid telling falsehoods and oversimplifying and just saying something false. So for example, in the hope of making things accessible, we sometimes transfer very abstract or idealized descriptions of scientific research into public contexts. But these descriptions are, strictly speaking, false. And in some cases, I think that even plays right into the hands of people who are trying to undermine science, the sort of people that I just set aside a moment ago. And then the translation fails. So here's a very basic illustration of this, right? Just to clarify the idea. In high school, in many parts of the world, we teach that there's a uniquely privileged procedure for investigating nature, the scientific method. It's privileged in the sense that when it comes to inquiring into the nature of things of scientific interest, the scientific method is like a recipe for making truths. Now, as it turns out, the idea of a method is an abstraction from some very specific forms of scientific investigation, especially found in the experimental disciplines of science. But there are lots of different forms of scientific investigation, and not all of them fit that mold very well at all. There is no one method. If you look at the amazing variety of practices that now fall under the heading of the sciences, from, say, investigating animal behavior to modeling quantum gravity, there just isn't a recipe that amounts to a common method, unless perhaps you describe it in such a generic or abstract way that it effectively becomes empty. The translation of the complexity of different scientific methods into the, admittedly inspiring, but nonetheless highly abstract idea of the scientific method fails in part because, as a description of what it takes to be genuinely scientific, a necessary condition on science, as it were, it's false. And one consequence of this is that it makes some scientific knowledge vulnerable to the promotion of skepticism. That is, it makes it too easy for some people to look at certain parts of science that aren't very well described by the scientific method and say, why should you believe that, right? It doesn't match what every high school student knows about science. So that's a very simple example of what I nevertheless take to be a serious class of challenges to science to society knowledge transfer, what I'm calling translational challenges. Okay, here's a second class of challenges. What's the upshot of our best science in terms of knowledge? What kind of knowledge do we get out of science? The answer to that question, as you've learned from some earlier sessions at this conference, is really contested by scholars who study the sciences. For instance, some people think that most aspects of our best scientific theories give us true, or at least approximately true, descriptions of the world, of the things that they're investigating. Some other people resist that view, and they resist it in a number of different ways. All of these people think that our best science does in fact give us knowledge, but taken together, these different views represent a number of disagreements about how to think about what that knowledge output is exactly. Now, as an aside, I should be clear that this isn't merely a disagreement among people like me, among philosophers. If I had more time, I'd tell you about how these same kinds of disagreements sometimes arise between scientists, even if they would express them differently and perhaps don't pursue them to the same great lengths that historians and philosophers of science do. Let me call this second class of roadblocks standing in the way of science to society knowledge transfer interpretational challenges. And here's a way of describing the example I just gave you. You can think of these disagreements in terms of a broad opposition between what I'll call instrumentalism on the one hand and appeals to approximate truth on the other. So instrumentalism is the idea that the sciences are tools for doing things, for manipulating things, for intervening in things, for changing the way things are, often so that we can tackle a problem like a virus in order to produce some specific desired outcome, like not getting sick. So instrumentalism is concerned with what works, and getting things to work in ways that we desire. On the other hand, approaches to interpreting scientific descriptions that emphasize approximate truth go further. They think that the sciences are good instruments for doing real kinds of work, but they go further, explaining why our best science is so instrumentally effective in terms of the truth of the relevant scientific descriptions in all of its details. There's actually no consensus about how we should interpret our best science here. And so no consensus about how to answer the question of what the upshot of science is very precisely in terms of knowledge, not among philosophers of science, and sometimes not even among scientists. So this is a serious challenge for science to society knowledge transfer. It's an interpretational challenge. Okay, just to give you a quick sense of at least one example of how these challenges, translational and interpretational challenges, can arise in practice, let me tell you a little bit about some work I've been doing recently on the nature of scientific disagreement and consensus. So earlier I mentioned that, sadly, as we know, sometimes special interest groups are very effective at misrepresenting science in the public domain. This is sometimes facilitated, I think, by misunderstandings of the highly variable nature of scientific disagreement. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, people who misrepresent science do this by emphasizing research that falls outside of the mainstream consensus in a field. They disproportionately emphasize outliers. This is obviously misleading because presumably high degrees of scientific consensus can and should be taken seriously by non-experts. But there are also cases of disagreement that don't take the form of a high degree of consensus on the one hand and a few outliers on the other. As it turns out, there are different forms, different kinds of scientific disagreement along a spectrum of what I would call, at the one end, relatively unsettled science, and at the other end, relatively settled science. In cases of relatively unsettled science, and we saw a lot of this at the beginning of the pandemic, we were just trying to get our heads around what was going on. In the case of relatively unsettled science, disagreement generally takes the form of disputes about what directions the research should go in, about what methods we should use. What's crucial about this sort of disagreement is that it tends to be relatively short-lived or transient. The science is relatively unsettled, but it becomes more settled over time. Conversely, in cases of relatively settled science, while there are, or while there may, of course, be developments in the directions and methods of research, the primary focus of disagreement generally concerns how best to interpret the science at issue. And here, I argue, disagreement tends not to be short-lived or transient. After all, it tends to be relatively stable. So perhaps you can see, even on the basis of the incredibly brief description I've just given you of a way of thinking about scientific disagreement, how interpretational challenges inevitably arise when we try to transfer knowledge from scientific context to societal contexts. In cases of relatively stable disagreement about the interpretation of relatively settled science, it isn't really possible to say, as we can say in cases of relatively unsettled science, that the disagreement is likely transient or just temporary. Instead, it's hard to say that we can expect it to be resolved as the science settled. We can't say that because here we're talking about relatively settled science and more stable disagreements. There's a lot more to be said about this, but I won't try to do justice to it today. Please just extract from this quick example of different sorts of different scientific disagreement the idea that there are, I think, principled reasons to expect that there will be interpretational challenges facing science to society transfer, that these things are likely to occur. Okay, so in the last part of my talk, what I want to do is focus on what I take to be the moral of all of this discussion of transferring knowledge from scientific contexts into the public domain for the public understanding of science. and more specifically, for the sort of public understanding that would, ideally, support the use of science in pursuit of the common good. One thing that's common to all cases of knowledge transfer, which I've hinted at several times now in passing, is what we might call the embedding of knowledge in a particular context, right? The idea is that in order for there to be a successful transfer, we need to take a description of something that functions well in one context and transfer it into another context in which it also functions well. When I say that a description functions well, what I mean is that it's embedded in a context of interpretation in which it helps us to achieve whatever goals we have, right, in that particular context. So again, just to give you an example, some of you may be familiar with what's called the Lotka-Volterra model. It's a scientific model. It's actually quite simple. It's just made up of a couple of equations. And it can be used famously to describe fluctuations in predator-prey population levels. So if you have a population of rabbits and a population of foxes in a particular ecosystem, their population levels kind of mirror one another over time in ways that you might expect, right? If the rabbits are doing well, there's lots of food, they will reproduce, the population of rabbits may increase. If there are lots of rabbits around to eat, the population of foxes will grow up because they have an abundant food source. But if the population of foxes gets too large, then they're going to predate the rabbits too successfully, and the rabbit population is going to start to fall. And once that happens, then the population of foxes is going to fall. So you have these varying populations that are kind of coupled with one another. And that's what's described by the Lotka-Volterra model, how these populations, right, undulate over time in a way that's coupled. So when I say that the model is embedded in the context of, say, ecosystem biology, what I mean is that it can be interpreted in that context to serve the particular purpose of telling us how these populations of organisms are going to vary over time. But as it turns out, the very same model can also be used to describe economic fluctuations in employment rates and the share of labor in national income. In other words, the same system of equations can be interpreted in a very different context, an economic context, in order to serve a very different purpose. The Lotka-Volterra model as a description can be embedded very successfully in these very different contexts of interpretation. That's what I have in mind by the notion of embedding. Successful embedding is what allows for successful knowledge transfer. Now, as we've seen, when it comes to transferring knowledge from the sciences into the public domain, there are serious challenges, what I've called translational challenges on the one hand and interpretational challenges on the other. And the most common response to this, right, how do we face these challenges? You see this response in a lot of the education literature, is to champion educational reform in order to achieve greater scientific literacy in the public. So just to give you a representative example of this, right? This is from a study of different conceptions of scientific literacy in the education literature. So this is from a paper by Norris and Phillips that they wrote in or published in 2009 that describe what they call the fundamental sense of scientific literacy. The fundamental sense is an understanding of scientific literacy that emphasizes the ability to read and write scientific content. Now, that's an appeal to a somewhat narrow, but strictly speaking correct, at least as far as the dictionary definition goes, understanding of what literacy is, right? In terms of, and here I'm just quoting the dictionary, right? Literacy is defined as the ability to read and write. So these authors and many others in the education literature argue that if science education doesn't provide this ability to read and write science, and here's a quotation from the paper I mentioned, it is not likely to achieve the good for citizens and society that we all desire. So, in a nutshell, the suggestion is that if we could only ensure that a wider general public knew more science, we'd be able to dissolve the challenges of knowledge transfer. Why? Well, because the public would have a more sophisticated understanding of scientific theories and models, which would then reduce the degrees to which these things need to be translated and interpreted, right? They wouldn't need translation or interpretation. These people would just understand it better because they know more science. In that sort of world, right, a wide swathe of the public, in virtue of having greater scientific literacy, would be able to embed the outputs of scientific work in an interpretive framework that's sufficiently similar to the ones that scientists have, in order to allow them to understand the nuances of that work well enough to incline them to do things like support effective science-based public policy and governance. Now, that's a noble suggestion, right? And as a philosopher of science, and as somebody who would like for there to be more widespread support for effective science-based policy and governance, I'd love for there to be more widespread science education. But if this is what we mean by scientific literacy and the public understanding of science, the goal, the aspiration to promote successful knowledge transfer as a basis for broader support for scientifically informed efforts to serve the common good is bound to fail. I mean, for one thing, it's impracticable. We just don't live in a world in which it's possible to ensure that a majority of our citizens acquire a detailed knowledge of the nuances of contemporary science. That would require a vast amount of highly specialized education over long durations of time for everyone. And the magnitude of this impracticability is actually much more severe than I've just suggested, right? I mean, let's grant, for the sake of argument, that we could actually achieve that utopian aim of educating most of society in such a way that we're able to generate high degrees of widespread knowledge of the intricate details of scientific theories and models. Well, even if we could wave that magic wand and arrange for that sort of universal education, we still wouldn't achieve the desired result because, as we all know, the sciences don't stand still. Whatever content non-specialists learn today is going to evolve over time such that later on, whatever they once learned back in the day will be outdated. And so I think if we want to overcome the challenges to knowledge transfer that I've discussed today, we need to think about the public understanding of science in a different way. Not in terms of understanding the content of specific theories and models, but rather in terms of understanding the nature of science as constituting a diverse set of practices that are specifically designed for and selected for, and that have as a central criterion of their success, the output of delivering empirical successes. In other words, what's crucial to the public understanding of science is not, in the first instance, knowing a lot of science, although that is, of course, a desirable thing in and of itself. Rather, what's crucial to the public understanding of science is an appreciation of the fact that, by design, the sciences are made up of a highly effective set of techniques which, collectively, function like a machine for generating answers to questions and solutions to problems concerning the natural and social worlds. So what does that mean exactly? I mean, what would that sort of appreciation consist in? Well, here's where I'll leave you with just a sketch of where I hope to go, because I think the answer to this question is implicit in a lot of recent history of ideas and history of philosophy. In the early 20th century, a very influential philosophical movement called logical empiricism attempted to establish the sciences as the exemplary means by which to produce knowledge of the world. Now, interestingly, in doing this, they weren't just interested in science for its own sake. They had a serious motivation or collection of motivations. They took properly scientific knowledge to be a basis for engaging in and bringing about social and moral progress. At the same time, the proponents of another very influential philosophical movement, American pragmatism, were arguing that concepts like truth and knowledge must be understood as having a pragmatic dimension. I mean, that what it is for a claim to be meaningful at all has to be understood in part on the basis of what we can do with it. They were articulating a view of how the sciences are tied to practical consequences in human experience. Now, views like empiricism and pragmatism are often associated with what I earlier called instrumentalism, the idea that scientific theory should just be thought of as tools of a certain kind. And not everyone agrees with that. In fact, probably most people don't. But I think that this disagreement obscures something that's absolutely crucial to a proper conception of how we should think about the public understanding of science. Everyone, whether or not they think that the sciences are merely instrumentally useful, think that they are and can be instrumentally useful. The sciences embody the best techniques we've managed to develop and continue to develop for manipulating, intervening, changing states of affairs, tackling problems, and producing desired outcomes in the world. Where these various people that I just described differ is in how precisely they explain that success, which is, of course, an excellent philosophical question, and it's one that's worthy of debate. But that doesn't undermine the more fundamental underlying agreement. And it's the agreement that should be at the heart of an effective public understanding of science and the focus of general science education. So there's an important story to be told here, I think, about how, despite all of the differences in how these different people think about scientific knowledge, they all recognize the same capacities of the sciences for serving the common good and for promoting our collective welfare. There's a shared and I think powerful conception here about what the sciences at their best can achieve. But looking at the clock, I should probably end there for today. So let me end there. And let me say once again that I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It was fun. You were ending up and I'm sitting there pondering the questions going around in my head and going around like I'm, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he's ending. So there's some really good stuff to think about. And I think you brought up, I think the sort of the pandemic and what we've been going through there. I think of sort of QAnon and Trump administration. I think the last 4 years of, and even conservative and conservative religious people who are this challenge against science, and how important the making sure the public understands not only the knowledge and facts of the science, but that and I think how you started at the beginning, that it does change based on what we're learning. And that's crucial for us to understand, but also for the general public to understand, and makes it more complicated in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So there are a couple of things in what you said that I think are crucial to understanding what I call the nature of science, right? I mean, one of them is that science is something that is a diachronic process. It's not as though you go into the lab today and you do science and then the science is done, right? I mean, science is something that develops over time. It develops from a state of what I call relatively unsettled science, where we're really just coming to grips with what questions we should be asking about some part of the world, all the way to a situation in which we've been investigating it for long enough that we think we have a pretty good take on how it works. But that spectrum between relatively unsettled and relatively settled is a huge spectrum. And I think what caused a lot of frustration during the pandemic was that people were looking to science to give them an answer to a question without really understanding the fact that it's a process, and that where you are in the process will determine, how solid, how stable the knowledge that we have is. And it also determines, how open-minded one is about the idea that people change their mind. When people change their minds or realize that what they were saying yesterday, it's true, but it actually holds in a smaller number of cases than we thought. And here's a broader truth that explains what's happening in other cases. When we do that sort of thing, it's not because science is bankrupt, it's because knowledge is developing. And unless you understand that process of diachronic change, you're just not going to understand why that kind of thing isn't evidence for skepticism about science. It's evidence for a kind of faith in the development of science towards better and better understandings of what's going on.
Yeah, and I would I would put a caveat for myself is I think there's some people who want to use that difference and distinction of the development to justify the way they think. So that's more of a societal comment rather than on a science comment.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And a lot of the people that I set to one side, but that are fascinating to discuss, the purveyors of misinformation and disinformation, will do that quite intentionally as a way of trying to generate skepticism about the knowledge generating process. And often they do it knowingly, which is especially malevolent because they know better, but they may have an economic, a political, an ideological master or end to serve. And so, all roads to that accomplishment are open to them.
Gordon asked a question. He says, it seems that explaining science to the general public sort of requires and has to begin with explaining experimental verification, the criteria for falsehood, peer review, and statistical significance. So what's your opinion of the rigors of scientific verification?
So this is something that I do think is extraordinarily important, but I think it's one of the things that I was hinting at earlier when I said that if we present too simplistic an account of what scientific verification is to the public and try to make that part of the public understanding of science, we're just asking for trouble. We are asking for the public to be manipulated by some of the bad actors that we were just talking about when they point to a particular area of science and say, well, this doesn't match up to the standards of empirical verification that you said was part and parcel of science. The point is that the different areas of the sciences are quite different in how they go about investigating, in perhaps even the standards of statistical significance that they may adopt for coming to certain kinds of conclusions, the way in which they may adopt stricter or more liberal standards of proof, depending on what's at stake, right? The ways in which they gather evidence, the kinds of evidence that they gather. Some parts of science are experimental. So, the questioner was saying, look, we should convey what it means to verify something in an experiment. That's great if what we're talking about is an experimental science, but not all of the sciences are experimental sciences. Right? Not all sciences are conducting experiments in the way that we often teach people to think about science in grade 10 or whatever it is, or grade 9 or whatever it is that people are introduced to the scientific method. There are parts of science that are more observation-based. There are parts of science that are more theoretical, where we're not doing experiments, but we're trying to unify parts of science by creating theoretical models, right? So a lot of fundamental physics right now is not experimental per se. It is very abstract mathematical modeling. It's not that it's not science, it's just that it doesn't conform very well to the idea of science that you might get just by saying that, well, this is how an experiment works. So this is part of why I'm saying that if we're too simplistic in what we convey about what the scientific method is and what standards of rigor we have, then we're either going to exclude most or much of what we actually think of as good science, or we're going to fix the idea of scientific method and rigor in a way that allows bad actors to point to some parts of science and say, well, this doesn't conform to your definition, so I guess we shouldn't believe any of that. And that's why I think that while we should teach those things, and I would love for people to know more science and know more math and know more statistics and know more about all the various branches of science, I would really like for people to understand just what the sciences are, that they're a collection of techniques that are adapted and suited for investigating different parts of the world in different ways. And that's what the sciences are. And if you internalize that message, then whether or not you understand what a degree of statistical significance is at all, you might still have faith in the relevant science to give you something that's worth acting upon.
Yeah. Chevy asked, and he says, perhaps this is a weird question for weird science. He goes, but let's give it a try. He says, why can't we use blockchain certification technology for science, i.e. to verify what we know to be facts? So it's already been proposed for legal purposes, such as trust and estates and wills, but but in contrast, not for new case law, which can be changed by subsequent opinions.
Okay. So I know that this is being filtered through you, Kevin, but
Yeah.
I really want to ask for a little bit of clarification, just because I'm not sure what blockchain certification technology entails in this case. Do you?
I'll bring Chevy in, and he can allow him to talk if he wants, so that he can ask that question. Oops. No. So Chevy's not coming through. Oh, no, there he is. Chevy, you want to ask? He took his mute off, but there's no, we have nothing's coming through.
Maybe he'll pop up again later.
Okay. So we'll go to another question. Some basic features of scientific are settled, quote unquote. Some anti-vaxxers do not believe in germ theory. Some think prayer will prevent disease. Should not basic high school education help understanding at the level needed for public policy? The public does not need to know what about does the public not need to know about current research?
Absolutely. So I should clarify that what I'm suggesting isn't, right, emphatically isn't the idea that we shouldn't teach science or that, you know, people shouldn't know things about the relevant science of the day that, you know, may be relevant and important to the kinds of questions that they're facing and the relevant actions that they're considering taking, whether or not to vaccinate their children and so on and so forth. Of course, they should know as much science as possible. So it's not that I'm advocating for a system of education in which people aren't taught science. I would love for everyone to be taught as much science as possible. And I think we do, to the extent that we're able, through news media and through science journalism and through, you know, public educators, and to whatever level people study sciences in their formal education. You know, we do a job of that, in some cases better, in some cases worse. But, you know, we do that, and we need to do it, and we should continue to do it to, you know, mitigate against exactly the sort of thing that the questioner is worried about, which is that some people will just, you know, not have any, will take alternative systems of belief that may not be especially credible and believe them when they conflict with the findings of our best science. The point is that if we rely on an understanding of how all of these things work on the part of people in everyday life to make good decisions on, then we're not going to get them to make good decisions very often. Because I can guarantee you that most people who think that it's a good idea to vaccinate their children and do in fact vaccinate their children don't really know very much about DNA, RNA, about viruses, about how they work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To the extent that most people who have their children vaccinated, right, do so, it's because they have a certain kind of faith in science. And so the question is, how do we, if we think that it's warranted, and I think it is warranted, right, how do we promulgate that kind of faith in science to be able to systematically investigate the world in ways that will lead to our common welfare and the common good? And that's by educating people with a conception of what the sciences are, what it is that they're doing, so that even if they don't know how a vaccine works exactly, right, to neutralize a virus, they can be confident that the best techniques we have for investigating how those things work in ourselves are being adopted and used so as to protect their children, right? If they understand that, that's the kind of public understanding that everyone needs to have, quite independently of whether they understand the finer points of biochemistry.
Totally, yes. That I was like, that makes sense. But that's the point, right? So another question, a little bit different. Truth and morality are like apples and oranges. They have distinct criteria for answering questions. Our best evaluation of what is truth is helpful in making value choices for public policy decisions. So what is your opinion on the relationship of truth to morality?
Well, in this domain, I think it's it's difficult to completely separate out, right, issues of truth and what more generally I would call values. Right? The domain of values is one in which we're often concerned with, for example, ethical or moral courses of behavior. What things do we take to be most valuable? What do we take to be good? What do we take to be better and best in terms of certain moral categories, like what's fair, what's just, what's egalitarian, what's so on and so forth. And, you know, there is a longstanding tradition which is just false, and we've heard it described very effectively in some of the talks in this conference, that really wants to separate out the idea of scientific truths, scientific theorizing, objective investigation of the world from our values. The reason we can't really separate those things out is that the sciences are a human activity. They are something that we as humans engage in to the best of our abilities. And as we've seen, the sciences, like any other human activity, are embedded in a society that, you know, at any given point in time may be operating with biases that it's familiar with or that it might not be aware of, that will influence what comes to be taken as scientific fact. So there was a great example in the Churia session yesterday, right, of how androcentric biases were operative, right, in thinking about developments in early hominids that led to what we are today. The scientific community at the time, that bias, that androcentric bias may have been invisible to them, right, until it was revealed, right? Because there were, you know, to caricature a little bit, a bunch of men proposing a model for how to understand these phenomena. And then with the kind of diversification of people who work in that area, these kinds of biases could be revealed. And we thought that, oh, these people were operating with a kind of hidden value, right? It was a sexist value, actually, now that we come to think about it. So what comes to be taken as scientific fact is very difficult to separate out from questions of value. And we need to pay careful attention to those issues so that we can get to things that we would be happier, right, to recognize as objective truths about the nature of the world. It's not an easy thing to do. So we shouldn't be too we shouldn't be too quick to try to separate out those things. We need to be thinking about both of them.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the session yesterday, the discussion of, because there were several times in your talk when I thought back to comments that came from that discussion and what you were sort of talking about today. So there's some great connections there. So Ruth was asking, she was, when I grew up in the 40s and 50s, I heard that scientists have named as absolutes the separation laws of conservation of energy and conservation of matter. But with atomic discoveries, it's been, you know, that's been changed, and accepted results were get your names theories. So Kant reviewing that more often, sorry, my reading here. Kant reviewing that more often help. Kant reviewing that things change as we learn more. Often help educate the public. So she gives an example. Einstein's theories were all mathematical models for a long time. Might some of the problem be calling ever more fields science be part of the problem?
Okay, great question. So I want to say yes, absolutely, to the first part of the question. And maybe I'd want to go in a slightly different direction with respect to the latter. So let me unpack that. With respect to the first part of the question, yes, absolutely. I do think, and this is part of what I have in mind by saying that the public understanding of science has to be made up of an understanding of the nature of science. It can't just be a bunch of scientific facts. And part of the nature of science is that it grows, it evolves, it changes over time. Now, that needn't lead to skepticism because, for example, it's very easy to see if you look back over the history of scientific theorizing, how things that we once took, right, to be our best, our most accurate descriptions of the way the world is, may be flawed in important ways, but they may have got certain things right about how the world works. And you can see how earlier conceptions of things may have folded into subsequent theorizing, right? one example of this is what I described earlier. Well, maybe, what we described, what Newton described, isn't really an account of how all matter behaves, but it's an account of how matter behaves when it's moving relatively slowly. And what Einstein gave us was a more general account that, in a sense, includes Newton's. It sort of adopts it, right, as a special case, but is talking more generally about how things behave, whether they're moving slowly or fast. So you can see how there are interesting continuities over time and how earlier bits of knowledge, where successful, get kind of absorbed into later bits of knowledge. And that is just part of what I'm calling the nature of scientific knowledge. That's what needs to be part of an understanding, a public understanding of science, quite independently of whether they understand Einstein or not. They need to understand that earlier things that we discovered that look pretty good have been preserved in a way in later conceptions of science. And, we shouldn't be afraid of that, because otherwise we leave ourselves open to exactly the kind of skepticism we were talking about before. It doesn't take a lot of very serious scholarship on the part of people who are trying to undermine science, right, to discover that, physicists today, anyone who is familiar with our theories in fundamental physics, know that they're not the last word. In part, we know that because they're inconsistent with one another. Our best theories in fundamental physics are actually incompatible with one another in interesting ways. So we know that that can't be the be all and end all. We know that there's more to come, right? And that just speaks to this purpose of development. On the other hand, that leads me to want to go in a slightly different direction with respect to the second part of the question, which I now can't remember, unfortunately. Shouldn't we? Oh, sorry, you're muted, Kevin.
I hit it. I tapped it, but it didn't go. Might some of the problem be calling ever more fields science a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are always problems in terminology here. I don't think that the worry is so much that we're calling different fields science. I think that that's just an inevitable outcome of the fact that we're studying more and more things that we perhaps hadn't studied earlier in more and more ways. And I think that those are, genuinely part of science. I think the things that we should worry about more are the sorts of issues we were discussing earlier, which is that, these different areas of inquiry may have different ways of investigating the world, different standards of assessing evidence, and so on and so forth, and that needs to be part of our public understanding of science. We shouldn't expect it to be one thing. But there are lots of other terminological issues. Every time someone says, our best theory concerning X, then some skeptic about the sciences is going to say, well, it's just a theory, right? And of course, that just betrays a misunderstanding of how the term is being used in a scientific context. So there are always these sorts of issues that need to be sorted out.
Great. And we'll do just a little bit broader question, just to sort of, and I want to respect your time and everyone else's who's here. And Ray says, he says, science sometimes creates socially destructive tools, nuclear weapons. He uses the example of Facebook. So how does science necessarily serve the public good?
So another excellent questions. All these questions have been great. So this is something that, again, I think speaks to the connection between science and values that I mentioned just a moment ago. I do think that it's incumbent on us to think about, to the extent that we can, the potential applications of the science that we do. Now, that isn't always very easy, right? It's true that in the Manhattan Project, they were trying to learn a lot about subatomic physics with the express purpose of making a bomb. But in a lot of cases, we do what's often called basic science, right? We're investigating things at a very fine-grained level of exploration without any particular technology or use in mind. We're just trying to learn about how something works. And that may potentially down the road be used in positive ways, it may be used in negative ways, and it's very hard to foresee how it might be used. In both of these cases, I think all we can do is try our best, and we do need to think carefully about whether we want to pursue all possible lines of inquiry. I myself, this is a personal opinion, but I myself think that it isn't obvious that we should just allow all possible lines of inquiry. There is a genuine desideratum, I think, of freedom of research that suggests that people should be able to research things if they're interested in them. Right? But there's also societal good to be taken into account. And research is incredibly expensive. So it's not as though we can just investigate everything. Why wouldn't we direct the resources of our best sciences towards things that we think and ultimately hope will benefit people? Right? And that includes basic science, where you might not be able to fathom the technology that will result in medical imaging now, but knowing how these little particles work may result in better medical imaging down the road. It includes that kind of work as well. And I think since we can't do everything, and because it's very expensive and we have limited resources, we should be thinking very carefully about what it's worth to work on and what's more important to work on than other things.
Yeah, I think in that example, somewhat specifically, I think while it's human values that determine we should use science for war, the science is still the science. At its basic principle, it's the use of it. It becomes the morals that we place on it, whether they're bad or good. And in that, I think, as you were just sort of describing that, the example that's really, when in that journey of trying to develop a bomb, the other things that we learned of in that discovery and the practical uses that we have now that so much benefits medical and science and other fields from that specific thing, I would say there's lots of good that came from it. While that may not have been the original intent, the science is still there, and the application of that science can still be used in lots of broad ways that are for good or bad.
And perhaps I could just add one sentence to that, because I agree with you, Kevin, although I do think that there are some cases in which it just seems pretty clear, if we think about it in a clear-headed way, that some lines of inquiry are just not worth our wasting money and time on. So, cognitive sex difference research, is that really worth the time that some people still want to spend on it? We have a history of showing that research is essentially valueless in trying to give us anything like serious results about whether there are cognitive differences based on sex or gender. And furthermore, we know that the history of that research has used and will inevitably be used for sexist and negatively othering purposes. So then we have a pretty good case, I think, to be made for just not bothering with that kind of research.
And yes, I completely agree. And I think it's also, I think, some of what was talked about in the discussion yesterday there are some avenues we don't need to take. There is not a point except to justify our biases and stereotypes and negative things that hurt people. And in that sense, yes, I agree with
bad science.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, I want to thank you very much. I know I will, you covered a lot, and I know I will be, working on processing bits and pieces of what you said, which is good. I love a discussion that does that. So that's fantastic. And I think, not only just the discussion you brought up and how that is, but also then how that relates to, I think, our current political and social environment and how we then translate that for us, how we translate that into students and how we work with them and making sure that messaging and understanding and the communication of that is so critical, important, not only just of science, but of whatever they're passionate about. I think there's lots of things that we can digest in this. So I appreciate your talk today. Thank you so much for being here. I will just say for the people, we have another session at 1:30, which is not on Zoom. So if people are interested, they can go on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube and watch that conversation. And it's Jeff Hawkins talking about his new book, 1,000 Brains, a new concept and theory of intelligence. So, but again, Anjan, thank you so much for being here. Really, truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, everyone have a good time, and we'll enjoy the session, and we'll see you back at 3 for the next Zoom.